Thank you all for coming, and we're just going to give a few minutes to allow people to stream in. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We are just waiting a few minutes to allow other participants to come on in. Thanks again for those of you who have joined us. We're just going to give a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. We're just letting people come on in. All right, we're going to get started. My name is Rachel Swarns. I'm a journalism professor here at NYU, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this important conversation, Beyond Black and White, the Roots of Anti-Asian Violence. This conversation is part of a new lecture series and research project that I'm launching, which is called Hidden Legacies, Slavery, Race, and the Making of 21st Century America. My goal is to bring together journalists, historians, and students to produce and promote archival work that illuminates the experiences of people of color in the United States. So I hope that you'll keep coming back for our upcoming conversations. And here tonight, as you know, history is increasingly a battleground for many people, unfortunately, around the country. But the work that I'm doing and the work that many journalists are doing, digging into the past, feels urgent to me. If we want to understand where we're going as a nation, we need to understand where we've been. And so with that, I want to introduce our panelists tonight. Our moderator is Mike Luo, editor of NewYorker.com, who is working, and he's working on a narrative history of Chinese exclusion in America. Welcome, Mike.
Great to be here.
We also have Jay Caspian King, a staff writer at The New Yorker, who is the author of The Loneliest Americans. Glad to have you here, Jay.
Hi.
And we have Erika Lee, president of the Organization of American Historians and author of many books, including The Making of Asian America. Thank you so much for joining us, Erika.
I'm so excited. Thank you.
So Mike is going to take us off into this conversation, but I do want to remind you, as you're listening, please put your questions into the Q&A. There is no chat. Just put your questions into the Q&A. We're going to talk for about 40 or 50 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. Thank you. Mike.
Thanks, Rachel. You left out the most important part of your my bio, which is that I was your editor at the New York Times.
That is true, and in fact, got me launched on the latest round of archival work that I am doing. We did that together.
Yes. So this is awesome. I'm really excited to talk to Jay and Erika. But big fans of both of your work, and this is obviously a subject that is really important to me and to a lot of people. Maybe Jay, I could start with you as the journalist in our little group here. You've been writing about Asian American identity for a long time. In fact, when I told David Remnick that we should hire you, I said we should hire the most thoughtful journalist in the country writing about Asian American issues, or one of the most thoughtful. On March 6, 2021, this was a few weeks before the Atlanta spa attacks, you wrote a column for the Times about the videos that were surfacing of Asians, many of them elderly, being attacked. You wrote at the time that it was still unclear what was happening, and even less clear why. I wonder if you can talk about what you meant when you said that. Think back to that moment, the reason it was so difficult to understand what was happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think I started with a few, like maybe 2 or 3 basic things that made me uncomfortable about the way that the narrative was coming out, right? The first was that all of this was very unprecedented, and that I had lived in the Bay Area, and that the center of a lot of this was the Bay Area because of the attack, the attack that went the most viral or was discussed the most was in San Francisco, right? There was also one in Oakland. And, when I lived in the Bay Area from like 2004 to 2010, I remember this also happening, right? Like a woman was pushed on the Muni stop. And I went back, and what I did was I looked at some of the old San Francisco Chronicle headlines from back in that era, and it was all the same. It was like there is a surge in anti-Asian in crime. Elders are being attacked. It's very violent, right? And so that made me very skeptical of this idea that like this was driven by like Donald Trump, for example, right? Or that it was driven by the coronavirus or people's response to, blaming Asian Americans for that. Now, do I think that that had like no effect on it? No, like it absolutely had some effect, right? But that the root of this
Mm,
was not what Donald Trump was saying on television. Now,
mm,
I think that like, that's what I was thinking back then.
mm,
Now I think that like, in the year that's passed or the year and a half that's passed
mhm,
since then, that like, I think that it's somewhat undeniable that this is not just like a repackaged problem that happens all the time and is, happening
mhm,
again. Like something
mhm,
is happening. But I do think that like my general impulse back then was to just say that like, the way that we're framing this right now, which is that
mm,
like we are victims of white
mhm,
supremacy or whatever, doesn't really
mhm,
fit in with what a lot of people are watching in those videos, which
mm,
is informed by a whole host of things, right? Like I think that attacks, right, when the
mhm,
perpetrator is black, tend to go more viral, right? Like
mhm,
that they're
mhm,
passed around more, but that you can disentangle all of that and you can sort of disseminate all of that, but there are
mm,
still people who are watching those videos who are getting a certain perception of what the issue is, right?
mm,
And that I think that there was a disconnect at the time, and I still think that this disconnect exists to a certain extent, although it's certainly,
mhm,
if you walk around San Francisco and you talk to people,
mhm,
it's they don't see a
mhm,
disconnection.
mhm,
um that
mm,
that the issue is much more complicated than just sort of
mm,
positing ourselves as people of color and saying that we're being
mm,
oppressed by like some American,
mhm,
by some like American white supremacy or something
mhm,
like that.
mhm,
And
mhm,
that I was just very interested in those two things, right? The
mhm,
first being, well, what do people who are watching these videos, what do they
mhm,
think is happening, right? And I
mhm,
think for a lot of them, they're like, well, we're being attacked
mhm,
by like young black men, right? Like that would
mhm,
be some of their perception. And
mhm,
then what was written about it, which was like, like this is all about Donald Trump.
mhm,
Like that disconnect was very interesting to me, right? Like, and
mhm,
I don't think that
mhm,
in that piece I really like said somebody was right or somebody was wrong out of the two.
mhm,
But
mhm,
I do think that there was sort of two sides talking past each
mhm,
other.
mhm,
Um, and then back then I did think, all right, like I remember when the woman was pushed in front of the Muni tracks. It's horrible, like
mhm,
that happened, I think in 2009 or something like that, 2008.
mhm,
I remember like, reporting on like a rash of attacks of Asian elders that
mhm,
about that was centered around, well, they're older and they're more vulnerable and they carry a lot of
mhm,
cash, right? Like that, those narratives come from the fact that like people remember all of that.
mhm,
And so I was skeptical at the time that
mhm,
what we were seeing was some huge surge. Now, I think
mhm,
that the way that we understand it now has
mhm,
been kind of, it's
mhm,
like been confused a bit, just because like I think that people try and quantify it in numbers and
mhm,
stuff like
mhm,
that. And I don't know what any of the numbers mean anymore,
mhm,
like when all sorts of different types of attacks can be classified as like quote anti-Asian hate, right? Everything
mhm,
from murder to like somebody getting up and standing on the other side of a bus or
mhm,
something like that.
mhm,
I don't know quite what we're tracking at this point. And I've kind of
mhm,
lost some of the narrative
mhm,
of what this is, while still
mhm,
being very, you know, while still like understanding that like this is something that people are very afraid of, and it is something that does feel real
mhm,
to me even,
mhm,
but I just don't
mhm.
know how to like quantify it or even discuss it.
Erica, but I'm really interested in what it was like for you uh, during this moment. This was Jay in that moment, kind of processing, um, trying to understand what was going on, and in his kind of journalist sort of mind of questioning statistics, questioning kind of overarching narratives and frameworks, and trying to actually kind of get at what was going on. As a historian of Asian American history, how did you process what was going on?
Yeah, thank you. And again, I'm really pleased to be talking with all of you and look forward to our conversation. I can sum it up pretty easily. And it was basically, it's happening again.
Mm,
And I'll take you back to even December of 2019, January of 2020. There were a few of us historians here in the United
mhm,
States, American historians, who were tracking the acts of hate, violence, discrimination, scapegoating of Chinese peoples that was being reported in Australia, the UK, France, Canada, so as the virus was spreading, it really felt like it was this trigger, this organic kind of, narrative of disease carrying Chinese peoples. And many of us were very, very aware of these narratives, the sensationalism, the media scapegoating that led to, that reinforced public health policies that targeted Chinese peoples and Asian peoples. The 1900 bubonic plague in San Francisco led to a quarantining of Chinatown, in which all Chinese people were basically, fenced in. They let the whites leave. So they're very real historic examples that date back a long time. But then we saw it during SARS. It is a trope and a narrative that can get used and reused very effectively. So we were looking at these news reports, and honestly, I had this growing pit in the bottom of my stomach, wondering not necessarily, will this happen in the United States, but rather when is it going to happen, and what's that going to be like? And so, and I'll talk about this, not just from, studying this and writing about this and teaching about this, to my students, but also as someone whose family was both, came to the United States, but was also separated by the exclusion laws. And, growing up with the Asian American version of the race talk that many Black families give their children. For me, it was one of awareness, wish it wasn't going to happen, but it feels like this very well could be, given our history and given just the realities of being Asian American.
Jay, you in one of your final columns for the New York Times before we hired you away, you wrote about this controversy that erupted with this James Sweet, the president of the American Historical Association, who wrote a column that came under fire about the dangers of what he called the overabundance of history, and how history has become this evidentiary grab bag for competing politics. And you critiqued, I think, some aspects of what he said, but you wrote about how this proliferation of history in the online political conversation, and you I think you were kind of poking at that writing trope that you saw, and you argue that this can sometimes distract us from the injustices of the present, is the way you put it. What did you mean by that?
Well, first of all, I mean, I don't think that it would be, I don't think I agree with Sweet, right? Like, because I think that the way that he was characterizing works of identity, like I could feel it, where I'm just like, all right, man, like if I write something, are you going to just automatically classify it as like an identity work that's driven by my own desire to like, I've been on the receiving side of that in my career as a writer. And like, there's nothing more frustrating than that, and I understand why people are very mad at him, because he's in this position of authority and he's kind of giving like, well, I'm the white guy and I'm the objective one, and you're all little cute identity people. But, when it comes down to it, I'm the objective one. And you're like that stuff, I think, is putrid. And, like, I understand what the backlash was, but I found that one of his central arguments was interesting to me. And it was just this idea, like, if we come up with like a kind of calcified narrative of who a people are, right? and that it satisfies some sort of current political desire that is like held by some portion of that people today, right? And generally, I think I would argue, and I don't think he was arguing, but I would argue that generally the people that type of narrative benefits are generally like the upwardly mobile part of that population, because they're the ones who have access to put out a certain narrative that would benefit them. That what really is history doing at that point, right? Like what is it? What do we have to always sort of go back to these moments? And now I was not criticizing in the piece historians or the use of history to try and understand the present. Obviously, it's something I do myself in my own book. I do it in the documentary that I just made. I mean, like, like this is something that I do as well.
A documentary made about Michael Chang, by the way.
Right. That talks about Chinese exclusion, talks about all this sort of stuff, right? Like, so it's not a question of whether or not these things can help inform or give a narrative, right? It's really the question I had was like, do we sometimes only have one narrative, right? And why is that? And so I think for Asian America sometimes that that there is a narrative that has very fixed points to it. And like, I don't even disagree with the fixed points to it, but I do think that because the field is small, right, and because we're not a large portion of the population, that that it sometimes becomes a bit smoother than other places. And that one of the things that I found interesting in it, and I didn't write this in the piece, but it's something that I've thought about quite a bit, which was, and I wrote about in the book a bit, which is that I do think that, like, if you think about Asian American history in a lot of ways, that the model for it is Black history, right? It is about like a minority people who are in the United States, and that they're sort of being moved around by systems of power, right? And that in the end, there is like a hope that there will be like a triumphant reckoning at the end of it, right? Like, and that is sort of a very flat way to look at Black history, right? And I think that there is a flat way to look at Asian American history as well. And I do think that when I read current journalism, especially about anti-Asian American hate, that sometimes I think that there is this desire to turn it into a big, sweeping, broad narrative in the way that like a bad movie might do with Black history, right? And this is not to insult any historians' work. I don't think it's the historians who are doing this. I think it is the journalists that are doing it, right? And so, and I think that when you can kind of lean on that as a crutch, that it can sometimes preclude you from asking other types of important questions, right? And I think especially for this question of like these attacks, right? There's so much stuff about immigrant communities that you can look into. There's so much stuff about class that you can look into, right? There's so much stuff. I mean, here in Oakland, like I live in the East Bay of California. Like the East Bay is basically like ground zero for this, like for, people, a woman just got shot like last week, right? And there's so much that you could look into, for example, about Oakland's Chinatown, right? And there's like all these sorts of things. And that sometimes I do think that as journalists, we do have an impulse to like start with exclusion, right? And to like kind of say, well, the reason for this is obvious. It's because we've always been hated, we've always been minorities, and and like that's it's showing up again, right? Or and I agree with that fundamentally, but I think that sometimes it's become too big of a crutch, I think. And that was sort of what my critique was, yeah.
Erika, do you well, one, I want you to react to what Jay said, and I am curious, like what it's like for you to see journalists using history in their writing. I'm curious if you kind of noticed this happening more frequently in the last couple of years, and what do you make of it when journalists in general are amateur historians?
Okay, we're taking out the knives already. I thought this was
it's a conversation among friends.
Yes, right. Well, first of all, I would love to just say, that one of the things I think that Jay is saying is that we need more history.
Yeah.
That we need, so if there is a flattening out of Asian American history, which I think we can talk about some more, I think it's because we don't have enough. We don't have enough of the complicated stories. We don't have enough people, journalists, call yourselves amateur historians, that's fine, you know, but we don't have enough students, we don't have enough scholarship, we don't have enough artists, poets, and professional historians doing this work. And I'll share with you just a couple of ways and the consequences that this has. I also, I'm like rolling up my sleeves because I'm going to be a professor. Just give me 5 minutes. But so we study not just history, but also historiography, right? The history of history, the history of how history is written.
Yeah.
And when I was a college student and even a graduate student, I could not major in this field. There were no graduate programs, very few. I did go to Berkeley, you know, but very few graduate programs who could train me. This field was not recognized as valid. It was thought of as tangential to the broader narrative of American history. I grew up in the East Bay. Whenever we would go to San Francisco, I'd look out at that big island, i.e. Angel Island, and say, what's that? And we were told, we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. And then there was also nowhere to learn about it within our history books or, you know, or the broader narrative. So I just want to emphasize how recent it is that there is such a field as Asian American history. So much so that now journalists can pick up a couple of books on Chinese exclusion and then take it from there. And so I feel very committed. I remember, you know, it feels like fighting in the trenches for every inch of space to get, you know, this field legitimized and institutionalized. One of the problems in the scarcity of Asian American history is that, you know, as a field, it takes the growth and expansion and competing, you know, debates. It takes longer because honestly, we're constantly just going over the basics. So every time I introduce, you know, or welcome a new class into a, you know, new group of students into my class, and I say, let's just start with, what do you all know? What do we know about Asian American history? And it's maybe 3 things. The Chinese built the railroad, the Japanese Americans were incarcerated. And that's on a good day, because honestly, there are some students who are writing down things that didn't actually happen in the United States, i.e. Asian history, right? But the most common answer is really, I don't know. I was never taught, I never heard, I didn't know, week after week after week. And so that means that the field, that our collective body of knowledge, we're simply just going over the basics with each other. And it's getting better and better and better and broader, but it makes it much harder for us to do the, you know, we absolutely do not have an overabundance of Asian American history, to be sure. And as we know, with the study of race and ethnicity, et cetera, we know that there are concerted and organized efforts to limit what we're teaching, both in terms of the bills and that are censoring classrooms, as well as the book ban. So it's very perilous time.
When Jay talks about kind of a desire to kind of hear complications and complicating narratives, are there some that come to mind? That you know, like I mean, I have all of your books, and you don't go over the same ground in all of them. They're very different, but like, are there some beyond the basic sort of things that just kind of come to mind as some of the complicating narratives that you've kind of gone down?
I'll talk about, I'll just offer two examples, one from the way in which the anti-Chinese movement of the 19th century used to be taught, and then one that might be more, more contemporary. So the way that it used to be taught was that at best, like the most sympathetic interpretation was, gosh, it was a really rough time in the United States. There's Reconstruction, the country's still divided. You've got growing power of labor unions, and the Chinese, they came. There were so many of them, and they kept on coming, and they were accepting work at lower wages. And so the anti-Chinese movement was the result of fears of economic competition.
Yeah.
Plus, they didn't really want to assimilate. You know, they kind of stuck together. They didn't learn the language. So you can see the narrative is, it was bad. You know, it's too bad that we acknowledge this was a dark time in our history, but it's kind of their fault. So that's the way it used to be taught. The way I think that we're talking about it today is that, wow, we have to understand the exclusion of China. Let's just stick with the Chinese for now, but the exclusion of Chinese, the mass purging of them from American cities and towns, the massacre of 18 of them in LA in 1871 as part of systemic racism in the United States, an offshoot related to our histories of slavery, settler colonialism, imperialism, etc. That's a shift. That's a shift. Another more contemporary shift might be that the 1965 Immigration Act, which I know both of you are interested in, you know, remade America, that American lawmakers finally saw the stain of discrimination as something bad, and we collectively as a nation decided to open up our gates once more to Asians, Latin Americans, and people from Africa, and now we are a nation of immigrants once again. We know that that's much more complicated. When I started to push back at that more romanticized history and pointed out, like many others, you know, this was unintentional. You know, if you read the congressional testimony, they're actually saying, don't worry, the Asians won't come. What about the population explosion in Latin America? Don't worry, we've got another way to fix that. When I started pushing back, there was pushback. I faced pushback myself from the older generation of scholars who thought the 65 Act was, you know, the civil rights law for immigration. And because some of them had been very active proponents in lobbying for it, right?
So. Maybe we should keep on the complicating narratives idea.
Mike, I just want to interrupt for a second and just remind people to please, as you're listening, when those questions are popping into your heads, as they are popping into mine, please put them in the Q&A. We want to collect them so that we're ready for you when we break for that section.
But Jay, I know, I'm glad you're kind of explaining yourself more here, because you're actually not against writing about history, journalists writing about history, because you write about it a lot yourself.
Right.
But you in your book kind of cite the late historian Noel Ignatieff, who wrote the book How the Irish Became White, as a kind of really influential figure in your life and someone who kind of informs a lot of your thinking these days. Can you talk a little bit more about him and how that kind of influenced your kind of historical narrative and the way you sort of tried to turn it around in your head?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, his book How the Irish Became White, that was like his sort of landmark book, right? And the study of the Irish immigrant population, mostly in Philadelphia, and sort of the ways in which, when they moved to the United States, they mostly live in Black neighborhoods, right? They're in the same labor force as Black people, and they, through a series of, I don't know, actually this goes to what Erika was talking about. I think in the old days, they would argue, well, like it just kind of happens. They kind of look like white people, and, over time they just got accepted as white people. But Noel's argument was that these were conscious decisions to separate themselves from Black people, right? And that the that the way that one becomes white is not by inertia, it's not by osmosis, it's by it is by conscious separation, right? And that was always very interesting to me, because I would think about, Asian people generally. And at the time when I was 18 years old and Noel was my professor, it's not something I was very aware of, But as I grew older, I think the reason why, I mean, he was influential on me just because we were friends, and he was very kind to me, but as I thought much more about his book, when I began to write much more about Asian America, it's just okay, well, you have this idea of white adjacency, right? You have this idea of assimilation, you have these sorts of things that are not true, right? But that they are definitely part of the perception, and that, there are people who do sort of go about life that way, right? And you also have a population of people who are intermarrying, and that you have children that are of two races, right? I think that's a term that they use here in the East Bay when you go to school, of two or more races. It's 20% of all the schools here in Berkeley. But what will happen in the future? And I did think about it in terms of my own child, who is, of two races and is going to grow up here in Berkeley, California. And, I grew up in North Carolina, and it's I was definitely Asian, there's only not that many of us, and it was very obvious. But what's this process going to be like, and is there a consciousness about it, and how does this history sort of fit into it, and then how does the history of people who come post 1965 differ from the people who were here before 1965? And that was sort of the general sense of inquiry in the book, I think. And Noel's work really was hugely informative in all of that, just because that idea of a conscious separation, right? That sort of was his definition. The term means something very different now, and I think it's, the term is worse now, I would say. But that was when he came up with the term white skin privileges, right? What he was talking about was what are the things that separate white people from Black people in the labor force, right? What are the privileges that white people believe that they have, and what is the significance of them, and why do they hold on to them so much when it should be obvious to them that they're poor, the Black people are poor, and the problem is management, right? Why do those small privileges that they receive have why do they have such a strong hold on them, right? Why do they convince people who are being exploited that they're, it's okay because I'm white, and I'm on the same side as them, we're on the same side. And how does that apply to Asian America? I think all of that's very interesting. So that was Noel's sort of influence on me.
Erika, do you have what's your take on Ignatius and and his kind of analysis about Irish Americans, and how do you see that relationship to the story of Asian Americans?
I think it's related to the broader need for us to understand the multiplicity, the complexity of the Asian American experience. My family is in the smallest minority now in terms of those who have roots prior to 1965. The vast majority of Asian Americans are the children, either the immigrants or the children, or honestly, the grandchildren of those who came after 65 or 75 with Southeast Asian refugees. And we're not sure yet how all of those stories fit together. And even if they do, And that's something for us to continue to think about. I do,
Mm.
though,
Mhm.
think about the ways in which racial identity is not just fixed
Mm.
in time to when your people first came,
Mm.
because as we're thinking about contingency, historical contingency or precedent
Yeah.
or foundations, right? You know,
Mhm.
so I think what has been so important or
Mm.
illuminating for Asian Americans
Mhm.
in the past couple of years is that some may have been very, very surprised at this
Mm.
resurgence of hate,
Mhm.
having not known the
Mhm.
history of those who had come before then, not known the history of anti-Asian racism, or
Mhm.
perhaps known it, but maybe didn't think that it necessarily applied to them. I think that
Mhm.
many of them realized that even though their family or their roots
Mm.
are much more recent, that America itself has a really long memory, and
Mhm.
that those foundations, those patterns are still at play. Still at play. My colleague Natalia Molina
Mm.
calls them racial scripts. Racial
Mm.
scripts that could be dusted off, you know,
Mhm.
applied to another group, but that they
Mhm.
can be, you know, pretty set in our collective memory.
Yeah, Erica, you stole my question that I had, which is taken from your book, The Making of Asian America, where you wrote, race has never been just a matter of black and white in the United States. Asian Americans have been both included and excluded from the country, sometimes simultaneously. In exemplifying this complicated and contingent history of American history, Asian Americans remain absolutely central to understanding the ongoing ways in which race works today. I actually thought you should explain a little bit more about what contingency means in historical scholarship.
Sure, it's always weird to have someone read back something that you wrote, you know, because you're
Yeah.
thinking, did I write that? Oh, I guess I did. It still works. So, you know, what does it mean to think historically?
Mhm.
We are interested in change over time. We're interested in context, of course, causality, complexity, contingency, meaning precedent, you know, that
Mm.
what happened before helps to explain what's happening now, and what's happening now is going to help explain what's the path, you know, or how things are going to shape
Mhm.
up in the future.
Mhm.
But it also is about
Mm.
that there were, remember those books, Choose Your Own Adventure? There are
Mhm.
many different outcomes that could happen. There are many different outcomes that could happen. It kind of depends on different factors, you know, one
Mm.
tilt one way. An action by one individual can upset the apple cart and lead to a whole
Mhm.
different set of
Mhm.
historical events. So, you know, an easy way to think about this is history doesn't just happen,
Mm.
right? History doesn't just happen. So unlike the ways in which so many of us were taught history with the timeline,
Mhm.
it's just so
Mhm.
dull and it's just, you know,
Mhm.
inevitable.
Mhm.
History doesn't just happen. That means
Mhm.
that we make history,
Mm.
but also that our choices are informed by
Mhm.
the possibilities that are
Mhm.
before us, what people did before us as well.
Mhm.
I think especially for Asian American history, I did say, you know, it's beyond black and white.
Mhm.
However, because our
Mm.
racial hierarchy has been and continues to be sort of, you know, set at this um, um, model of
Mhm.
white over black, where Asian Americans have fit in, as well as
Mhm.
Latinx folks, Jewish folks, the Irish, et cetera, you know, has depended um, on those possibilities. And in particular, the rights or the
Mhm.
non-rights that Asian Americans have had have been directly impacted by the rights or the non-rights that African Americans have had.
Hmm. um, um, I, a question maybe for both of you. I've I've kind of just been asking these questions as an impartial, neutral observer, but I've committed my past year and in all my free time to being immersed in 19th century history of Chinese exclusion, and my parents are in the post 1965 generation, and the thing that I keep thinking about, as I'm immersed in all these archives and newspaper articles is what's kind of or what is or isn't kind of immutable about the Asian American condition in America. And I wonder if that question even makes sense to you, but it's the thing that I keep thinking about over and over again as I read about the driving out, as I reading about these episodes that led up to the Exclusion Act and all that happened beyond that. And I'm just curious what both of you think of that. Jay, I wonder if you could start, and I would love Erika to hear your take on it.
So the question is like the immutability of the condition, or of the term, of the phrase?
The experience, I think.
Oh, well, I think that the immutability, it's difficult to come up with a sense that it's immutable, because I do think that the experience of people is so different, like here, if you drive like 20 minutes from where I live, there's like a Laotian population, for example, right, that live very, very different lives than the people who are, I don't know, people who live in Orinda or something like that, right? Or even here in Berkeley, right? Like it's very different, right? And that it's hard to think of one experience that binds them all together. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's what Erika was talking about, which is like people are still kind of trying to figure it out, right? Like they're trying to understand, and that it hasn't really been that long. It's been like 57 years or something like that, right? Where in most, right post 1965, there weren't that many people coming, right? Like the actual large amount of people come a few years later and during the 70s. And that I think so. I think it's difficult to say that there is like an immutable condition, but I don't think that I think that the one immutable condition is probably like what people would just say is like the perpetual foreigner idea, right? Like that one I think is one thing that does bind people together, and that is caught up in everything that is through history. The idea of it was mentioned before, the idea of like disease carrying people, right? Like, I mean, if you look in the archives of San Francisco, like you find all sorts of images of like diseased Chinamen, right? And I don't think it's wrong to link those together, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think it's wrong to say that this is something repeating itself. Mm-hmm. But I think that in terms of like the day-to-day lives, right, that there is something that sort of unites all these disparate groups together. I think it's much harder to make that argument.
Mm-hmm. Erika, what do you think?
Yeah, I would pause to use the phrase immutable. First of all, it takes away the agency, takes away historical agency, because for every repeat or pattern, there's likely an exception, or there's someone mm-hmm. who stood up, there's someone who pushed back. And mm-hmm. so that's not a phrase that mm-hmm. that I would use in the study mm-hmm. of history. We talk about patterns, we talk about themes, we talk about, I'm sure you all do too, when you're thinking about what binds, different pieces of evidence together, different storylines together. But that, for me, I chose a history of migration that has bound many generations of Asians in the United States together. I also chose predominantly a history of race and racism that has mm-hmm. bound people together. But of course, race and racism changed from the inestimable alien to the yellow peril to the model minority to the COVID carrier. And I also chose to frame the big history of Asian America around transnational and global trends and factors, including imperialism. That's the great thing about history, is that that's my, that's the way that it made sense to me. But you can take away one of those and add 3 more, and then we could have another conversation and think about how that expands, not only our knowledge, but helps us to better understand how communities are made or not made.
At the risk of committing one of Jay's errors of oversimplification and uncomplicated narratives, I wanted to end, because this is, I think we're going to do one more question, then we'll have some Q&A on something kind of positive, and I wonder if there's anything from history for both of you that give you some optimism about the present moment that we're in. Maybe Erika, you can start.
Yeah, so the positive thing is that more and more young people are interested in and fighting for Asian American history, for the study of Asian American history. And not just about contributions, not just so that they can see themselves in American history, which is important, but because it is part of the broadest telling of our American past, and that they have seen that the erasure of Asian American history within their own classroom experiences, they believe, have helped to lay the foundation for ignorance, hate, dehumanization, scapegoating, etc., that they have experienced themselves. And so they themselves, this new generation of high school students, middle school students, and college students, have led this movement that has now resulted in 4 states requiring Asian American Pacific Islander history as a graduation requirement. That is honestly, I mean, I don't think, remember how we started this conversation and like, as a historian, I knew this was going to happen. This, I did not imagine would happen, but I am so inspired by what's going on and what they are doing themselves.
Jay, what about you? I don't know if you're an optimistic guy, but what do you what in history gives you?
I think it's cool that all the kids. I think it's cool my kid has to learn Asian American history too. I mean, I think it's great. I mean, I didn't learn any of it in North Carolina. I can tell you that much. We didn't even learn about the 2 things that students in Erika's class might bring up. So but I think that the reason that I have a lot of optimism is I actually think the conversation right now around Asian America is very interesting. I think it is getting more contested. I think that there are a lot more different views being expressed and a lot more different iterations of things. And I think that that I'm excited by it. Like I think that so there was a period of time where I was like, I can't write about this stuff anymore because it's like, like this was a while ago, but it's just like, I don't know, but now I do think that there are different, that people have different, there are different perspectives coming in. There's much more conversation about class that is coming in that I find very exciting. There's much more conversation, I think, about like labor that's coming in. I also find that very exciting. And I do think that there is a complication that the sort of way in which this stuff was done in the past, which was always a little bit, oh, something very strange is happening next door to my house. It's like a shirtless man walking outside my window, peeking at my neighbor's house's windows. I'm sorry if I might have to go in 2 seconds. It's really weird. Just to finish up, I think the conversation right now is going in a good place, and I think that that if we fight or if there's arguments that happen, that that they're generally gonna all be positive, even if they're not particularly positive. The people who are at the, who are having the arguments, that I actually think that it's broaden things. And I don't know, I'm excited about it. Like I think right now is a very exciting time of definition, and something's going to come out of it. Like, I actually don't know what, but like, like I think that something is going to come out of it that's going to be like, pretty important for a lot of people.
Okay. Well, thank you. So we've got some questions in, and if you have questions that you'd like to ask any of our panelists, please put them in the Q&A. We've got Dee Dee with a question saying, how has journalistic coverage of violence against Asian Americans helped or hindered the stop, hindered the, or hindered, let me repeat this again, helped or hindered this Asian hate movement?
Mike, you want to answer?
I guess, has coverage affected it,
I guess let me think. Rachel and I have a relationship that goes back to I mentioned that when I was her editor at the New York Times, and and we were on this team together that was kind of this kind of cross desk sort of race sort of team, and I think you all kind of know this, but there was this moment that happened to me at the end of my tenure at the New York Times in October of 2016, when somebody yelled at me and my family to go back to China on the street in Lexington Avenue on the Upper East Side of New York City. And I just wrote this. It was Rachel, actually, who made me write up this little thing. Mark Lacey, an editor at the New York Times, who kind of ran our team, and I wrote just kind of this open letter. I literally like pecked it out in like half an hour about to this woman, and we and it touched on some of these themes of otherness and the perpetual foreigner and that kind of thing, and it was just kind of a reflection of my feelings in that moment. And the New York Times, the piece went viral. It put the New York Times put it on the front page, and it was really just like kind of like this really very kind of precursor moment. This was before Trump was elected. It was starting to kind of that language was happening, and it actually changed the trajectory, I think, of me. And I went to the New Yorker. I used to write about all kinds of things, and I still write about all kinds of things. But this moment had kind of, at least for me, kind of shifted what I felt like my responsibility was as a journalist, and so and I think it ended up it affected the New Yorker in different writers that we have. We have a bunch of different writers who have written about Asian American issues in really sort of significant ways. Jiaying Fan, Wasu, Jay, and I think the question is about how has it sort of affected the larger sort of movement? I think like what that has done, I think is I think like journalists kind of help take things from the idea continuum over the sort of continuum of ideas where we do sort of draw on ideas from historians and like Erika and put them into the sort of public sphere. And I guess I feel like that has an impact. I kind of see I guess like this is kind of a reflecting on the kind of the body of work that we have published for at the New Yorker about this issue, and the way it has kind of provoked sort of larger sort of conversations. I mean, I just think that it's part of this kind of broadening effect. That's my take on it.
You know, Mike, I was actually going to ask you about that moment in 2016 when that happened to you and your family. And actually my question was, I'm curious as to whether or not your immersion in the 19th century, if you look at that any differently, if it, you know, how do you process that? You know, how does it connect to you or not? You know, how do you think about it?
I mean, I think that moment, you know, it was just a weird accidental moment, but obviously there is sort of it's part of a larger sort of thing going on. It set me on a journey because I actually like that what Jay's talking about. I grew up in sort of suburban white sort of areas and didn't know any of this stuff, like the basic stuff, you know, that Erika sort of talks about, like none of this stuff. I didn't know any of it. And so to be honest, like I read this stuff in these newspapers from the 1870s and it's just mind boggling to me. I think
to a lot of people, honestly, yeah, because we don't know, which is, you know, but that Erika's talking about, we really don't.
Yeah,
too many of us.
I read these things out loud. I mean, I mean, I'll just indulge me with a little anecdote from yesterday. And Erika knows the story obviously so well, but like I was reading about the Tape family, with the famous family that Joseph and Mary Tape. Mary Tape didn't even speak Chinese. She only spoke English. They had an 8-year-old daughter. And tried to enroll her in public schools in San Francisco, and they wouldn't allow it. Took it all the way to the California Supreme Court, and they ruled that you have to allow this child into San Francisco public schools. The public school said, no, we were not going to do this, but then they created a separate school for Chinese only. And then I was reading the immigration interrogation of a Tape family member from 1940, 1920, 1930. It was several decades later, and just as part of the Exclusion Act, when he was trying to re-enter the United States. This was actually actually what it was an interrogation of Mammy Tape, the girl, the 8-year-old girl who became an adult, and I was just saying to my wife, I cannot believe this child who went through this, born in America, American citizen. Look at the way they're questioning her. It was unbelievable to me. I think the interrogation was in 1940 something, and to me it still blows my mind. And so, anyways, it really does. Sorry, I just needed to convey this, my excitement.
When you find something, it's like amazing. Okay, we have another viewer who has a question. How do you think the issues discussed could advance legal reforms, education, and coalition building between different racial and ethnic groups?
I'll take a stab at it. First of all, I'm just so thrilled that Michael's turning into a history nerd. I mean, when you start quoting legal testimony at the dinner table, then
I read it to my wife.
Yeah, you have a problem. No, it's okay. No, hey, the more people who know this history, the better. The question is about how might the issues that we discussed help advance
coalition building between different groups.
Yeah. So I'm going to sound like a broken record, but know your history. So I'll share another example, and that is the landmark Supreme Court case of Wong Kim Ark. And if you don't know who he is, Google him right now. He was Chinese American citizen born in the United States who went to China to visit his parents a few times. And on one of those return trips was put into immigration prison because immigration officials were going to use him as a test case to determine whether birthright citizenship could apply to Chinese Americans whose parents,
When?
1898, whose parents by law under the Exclusion Act could not become naturalized citizens. And so it blew open this whole debate. What is birthright citizenship? Is it about where you're born, jus soli, or is it by blood, who your parents were, jus sanguinis? And the argument that the US government made was his parents are citizens of the Emperor of China and cannot are ineligible for US citizenship because our naturalization laws were limited to only white persons and then African Americans with the 14th Amendment and the Reconstruction amendments. And so Wong Kim Ark, this Chinese American born citizen, even though by accident of birth, accident of birth in the United States, does not qualify for birthright citizenship. And he took the case to Supreme Court. So let's just pause. Because the first thing we have to understand is that the whole reason why birthright citizenship was even a possibility for him in 1898 is because of the 14th Amendment and because of African Americans' activisms to get that amendment in place and to pass it, to guarantee citizenship rights for formerly enslaved peoples and free Blacks. So like I said, we Asian Americans have often been able to expand our rights because African Americans have done it before us or in concert with us, etc. His case goes to the district court. The district court rules in Wong Kim Ark's favor, but the US government takes it all the way to the Supreme Court. And again, the Supreme Court does rule in Wong Kim Ark's favor and thus reaffirms that the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship does indeed apply to all persons born in the United States. Wong Kim Ark was in the news, when Donald Trump was running for president, because in his immigration plan, when he was a candidate, he put down end birthright citizenship. And there's a bill that has been routinely introduced into Congress, beginning in the early 2000s, targeting children of undocumented immigrants, US born children of undocumented immigrants, US born children of refugees, US born children of parents who are in the United States temporarily. And their rights to birthright citizenship have so far been secured because of the Wong Kim Ark ruling. That I'm trying to use that example to say, listen, if we know that history, then, I as an Asian American can understand that what happens to African Americans is important to me. And that I hope that others might understand that the struggles that African Americans and then Wong Kim Ark and other Asian Americans engaged in to protect citizenship rights now protect theirs as well. Our history of they might not have been holding hands and marching together, but those rights that were accrued have had far more broad consequences than just one community. And that to me can be a foundation for coalition building, cross-racial solidarity today. let alone obviously understanding the contemporary context of how our plights are connected as well.
Thank you. Okay, next question is, I wonder how the panelists view the discourse around Asian American identities being impacted by the US's foreign policy position against China, not to mention the complicated geopolitics in Asia.
I can take this. Yeah, I think it's definitely impacted by the United States' relationship with China. I think that the perception of China since the Olympics, the Beijing Olympics to now has really shifted quite dramatically, right? And that I think that people's relationship, even with like students, right? The Chinese students who come to the United States. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that like the narrative was that China is going to finally open up, and that that the economy is opening up. It's inevitable, right? It's all the stuff that Francis Fukuyama wrote about, right? Like the end of history, like all these places will eventually open up, and that we'll have a whole world of liberal democracies, right? And the fact that that didn't happen is in some ways due to US policy, and but in some ways it's US policy responding to changes in China. And that I don't think that I find that to be a much more interesting place to start when discussing the geopolitical ramification or the geopolitical sources of some of this, like of anti-Asian hate. Like I think much more interesting than talking about Donald Trump, for example, right? Even though obviously the two are linked. And I do think going forward, it will be the most impactful source of anti-Asian American sentiment. I think it will definitely be sort of anti-Chinese sentiment within government, both parties, right? This is not like a Democratic Republican type of thing. And that essentially, I think we're at this space right now where like you could say anything about China and what China's doing, and almost everyone in America would believe it, right? And that I think that there will be politicians who take advantage of that, and that that is concerning, right? I think it's more concerning than some of the rhetoric that comes out, and I think that that's why it's important to think internationally. Right. I think it's why it's important to think about things in terms of, like, you think about 1965 Immigration Act, for example, right? There's a narrative out there like that Erika was discussing that was like, oh, well, all these people like finally woke up and they decided, hey, let's let in some people, and like completely ignore all the stuff that was happening in terms of like the Cold War. They're talking like around like conflicts with Russia that were taking place in Asia, like Korean War, like everything that was happening that would make it so that the United States needed basically like a half-hearted PR, like propagandizing measure, just like the Hart-Celler Act, right? Like was discussed, like they were like, well, I don't know, like we can do this thing and it'll stop some of the messaging that's being put out there in Asia that like you should not ally ever with the United States because they hate you so much they won't even let you in their country, right? Like that was a sort of thing that was going on at the time, and that that the response from the United States was basically, okay, we'll do this thing, but like no one's going to actually come. We don't really mean it, and then a bunch of people came, right? But you can't really understand that narrative without understanding all of the stuff that was happening in Asia, right? And so I think it's important, like, I don't know, I just think that having a broad internationalist type of understanding of this stuff is extremely vital. And I think that if you just fixate on what happens in America, then you've likely missed like, the majority, or at least a good portion of what's actually happening.
All right, Helena Cheng has a question. She says, do you believe that more radical activism or protests are inevitable when it comes to raising voices for the Asian American community, like Black Lives Matter?
Well, this is sort of my field, so but I'll just keep it short in case other people want to say. I think that the one big misconception, and something I think about quite a bit, is that there is a assumption that whatever protest movement comes out of this moment will be like progressive, radical left and like in solidarity with other groups. And I don't think that's true at all. I think that most likely the sort of protest movement and that the strongest activist type of formation will be right wing because of these because of the anti-Asian attacks, right? And it will be stuff that makes, I think, people who are on the left deeply uncomfortable, because I think a lot of it will be anti-Black, and I think a lot of it will be about centered around sort of consolidating an Asian American type of nationalism, right? And you already see it. I mean, again, like I live in the Bay Area where I think it is much more intense, right? I see it in the Bay Area everywhere I go, like is that like you have formation of the formation of like a new type of like mostly centered around Chinese Americans, but like kind of like this Asian American pride thing that's happening. It's very instrumental in the school board recalls here. It was very instrumental in the recalling of Chesa Bodine, right? And that is the activism that's coming out of it right now, right? Like we can sit and we can say like, oh, well, there are these people who are in solidarity with it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that has existed in the Bay Area for a very long time. And it is something that like is important, but it is not an insurgent force, right? The insurgent force, I think, is like this kind of new reactionary racial nationalism that's happening. And like, I think that's what the movement is going to be.
We have another series of questions that are actually quite linked, where viewers are asking about the experience of newer arrivals, about new Chinese immigrants, people who came to study after 2000. And so I'm going to try and link some of them together. Do you think that the experience of Chinese immigrants who came to study after 2000 is different from those who came before? And someone else, Jenny, brings a racial element into that. She wonders whether or not new Asian American immigrants who are foreign born and immigrated as adults may not have the same kind of racial consciousness as Asian Americans who were US born. How do you see their role? So a lot of interest in kind of how newer arrivals, like post 2000, where do they fit?
Erika, you should take that.
Well, I can start, but I think you and Jay will have other things to add as well. So absolutely, there are differences. Every generation, right? Every generation, there are different factors that shape migration. So what were the conditions back in whatever the homeland is? What are the opportunities, both economic, but also legal, in terms of which pathways to the United States are available? For my grandfather, the pathway was one of coming in with false papers. Today, the pathway may also be one coming in with false papers or overstaying a visa, or there may be more additional ones based on professional skills, et cetera. It also depends on something that we've started to talk about now, but US-Asian relations is the country that the person is leaving or tied to, friend or foe. How much? So if we were just to consider more recent Chinese immigrants from 2000 versus even going back to, say, the 70s, let alone the 19th century, all we have to do is think about how much China itself has transformed. Leaving China in the 70s versus leaving China in 2015, totally different situation. Also, similarly, coming to the United States is different. What are the opportunities available? There were hardly any, for example, Asian American lawmakers in 1970 compared to today. That's just one facile, comparison, let alone all sorts of other types of durable factors that we might consider: voting power, economic status, diversity of experiences. So yes, very, very different. And this is one of the challenges, just again, as a teacher of Asian American history, I've been talking about the challenges of students who have been raised in the American school system, not having enough, not just Asian American history, but American history in general, broadly defined. What about children who, or families who have come that have been educated without very much American history, or perhaps, quite a very narrow perspective. Not to say that their other educational experiences are not valid, but we will, for a small field, and I was talking about kind of spinning our wheels and how it feels like we've had to go through the basics like over and over again. We're going to have to continue to do that. But at the same time, with more books and articles and journalists and staffers and Congress at all levels of representation. All of that is helping to make a change. So I tried to answer both of those questions in one. I don't know if I did anything, but I turn it over to Mike and Jay.
Well, I've got a question, and we're going to be wrapping up. You have seen, and we talked a little bit about this moment where you're seeing among, at least, and I'll direct this to Erika and Jay maybe too, where you've seen a lot more interest, at least among journalists, in writing about this history, about exploring the history of Asian Americans and early arrivals here. And I'm just curious, as you see more, and journalists are doing this more in a number of ways. I'm just curious what your thoughts are, what advice, if you have any, to journalists you would give, and what you make of this moment where there is this kind of effort among journalists, growing effort to kind of mine the past, as you're seeing now.
Thanks, Rachel. I mean, so we started to talk about this in an earlier conversation. I think it's great. I am learning from all of you. I know that you all are reading works of history as well and going into the archives. That's really important. You have to read those sources yourself, because my interpretation is not going to be the same as yours. And so going back to the sources is really important. I do have to say, there's one little quibble, and that is I'm always a little annoyed when I see an article title that's something like "The Forgotten History of X, Y, and Z." I'm like,
forgotten by who?
Exactly. I mean, I and my students have known about that for a while. So, but I get it. You gotta make the pitch. I think that it can only bring more knowledge, more stories, more complexity. Michael shared with me a research discovery that he had made, which helped to solve a mystery that I had for a while. Hadn't gone into the deeper archives to research, and so that's all fantastic. I think more conversations like this is super helpful. I think there's lots of ways in which we can all continue to work together and create new things that help to, help all of us and help to contribute to the larger story and complex story of Asian America.
Right. Yeah. And I think, to Jay's point earlier, I think the complexity is what's so interesting. And I think, at least in my experience in digging around, it's just, we all know there's more. And I think, as Erika said, more people in the academy with you, Erika, and I'd like to say outside with us too, doing this, more of those complicated and interesting stories those narratives will emerge. Well, I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us tonight. And I want to thank everyone in the audience who came to participate. And I hope you'll be back. We'll be doing a number of conversations in this series. And just want to thank you all, Jay, Erika, and Mike. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Have a good night, everyone.
You too.